Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Decoding the Talmud, our 6-week tour inside the story, substance, and significance of the book that defines Judaism. Today we are doing lesson 4, which is titled To Create the Talmud. We are going to learn some of the history about how the sages shaped its structure and substance, and then we are going to dive into some of the Talmudic some of the Talmudic tools, if you will, as to how they analyze the Talmud. We started this last week, but we are going to continue it this week. This afternoon and evening's lesson is sponsored by not just Ms., but Dr. Gail Levine, and another sponsor who is anonymous, co-sponsored by the two of them together, and we thank them for their sponsorship. They'll both be here this evening, which we appreciate. So you might remember that when we discussed the Mishnah, we kind of did it in 2 parts. This was lesson 2. And I don't know how fresh this is on your memories, but in lesson 2, we kind of started with the first half of the lesson was kind of the history, showing you what was going on, in world history in terms of persecution of the Jews, and how the Mishnah came at an exact time and we kind of gave you the whole history of that, and then explained to you why Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Prince, felt it was so important to compose the Mishnah, or redact the Mishnah is really the proper way to put it. And then we started to get into the actual Mishnah. We brought an actual Mishnah and we unpacked the Mishnah the first week, and then last week we unpacked the Talmud, or the Gemara's analysis of the Mishnah. Beautiful. Last week, when we started Gemara, which, as you remember, every piece of Talmud is a Mishnah, and then the Gemara's analysis of the Mishnah, when we started to do that, we just kind of dived right into it. We jumped right into it, and we didn't really give you the history of it. So that's what I'd like to do with you today. We're going to try to get some history of the Gemara, and that's going to help us understand some other details. For starters, the Gemara is a compilation of the teachings of the sages that took place over the course of a 300-year period, from around 200 to about 500 CE of the Common Era. And after the compilation of the Mishnah, these sages, obviously, as we spoke about last week, they delved into it enthusiastically to try and unpack it. Now, the Talmud comes to us in 2 versions. Behind me here on the shelf, you see the Talmud Bavli, or the Babylonian Talmud. Anybody want to guess where this? So if this is a summary of the record of those sages, anybody want to guess where those sages lived? Correct, in Babylonia, in an area called Bavel. It's actually our first key term, Bavel. That's the area. You can see it on page 121 in your textbooks. It's the area within the Parthian and Sassanid empires that is north of the ancient city of Babylon. The majority of diaspora Jews during the era of the Second Temple and the Mishnah lived in this area. There was another region, however, where this analysis of the Mishnah was taking place, and that, of course, was in the land of Israel. We call it the Jerusalem Talmud, but actually it's not just in the city of Jerusalem, it's all over Israel. And together, those become 2 separate compilations, the summary of these analyses of the Mishnah, one happening in Babylon, one happening in Jerusalem. Now, it's important to understand that historically, what's going on in Jerusalem, politically that is, right, is that they're already, ever since the destruction of the Second Temple, which is around the year 70 CE, which is 130 years before the conversation about that the Gemara is having even takes place. Ever since then, the Jews have been under Roman rule. And we saw already in one of the previous videos that those Roman rulers were of varied degree of, anti-Semitic, if you will. They persecuted the Jews to one degree or another, and then there were these client kings that were kind of Roman kings that were Jewish maybe, but that were under Roman rule, etc. Around the year 200, I'm sorry, not 200, give me a second, no. In the early 4th centuries, this is 300 and something of the Common Era, the Roman Empire officially adopts Christianity as its state religion. I'm not going to get into all details of that, but there was an emperor who today is known as Constantine I. He converted to Christianity formally in the year 323 of the Common Era, and as a result, right around then, the Roman persecution becomes much more intense. And finally, around 350, there is a widespread clash between Roman forces and the Jewish people, which leads to a massive decimation of the Jewish population. It also brings about a tremendous migration of Jews leaving the land of Israel, going to Babylon. Anybody remember how the Jews got to Babylon? So this actually goes back, this story goes back to around 300 BC, 400 probably BCE, I don't remember the exact year in my head, but basically after the destruction of the first temple, which was by the Babylonians, led by Nebuchadnezzar, who was their their king, he brings lots of Jews down to Babylon. And when 70 years later, which is around 300 BCE, the second temple is built under the Persian, I think it was the Persian Empire at the time. That's after the story of Purim, by the way, which we're celebrating next Friday. When that happens, not all the Jews come back up to Israel. Many of them stay in Babylon. They start to pilgrimage there when it comes to the holidays for 400 years while the second temple is standing. But there's still a huge Jewish population in Babylon. Okay, so that's still going on after the destruction of the second temple, and around the year 350, you see a massive migration of Jews coming down from Israel down to Babylon, down to Bavel, as it's known, and they join the Jews that were happening, that were going through this rigorous study of analyzing the Mishnah that was going on in Babylon. So that's why the Jerusalem Talmud, till today, somebody asked this in a previous lesson, and I gave him more of a philosophical answer about why we study more the Babylonian Talmud than the Jerusalem Talmud, but the more practical answer is that's the way history works. The last one has the last word, right? So the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud never finished going through all the different tractates. The Babylonian Talmud did a much better job of it. They still only go through about 90% of the tractates, or 80%. In other words, this study of analyzing the Mishnah in the Gemara style, which we started learning about last week, but they do cover a lot more. And the sages there are not just the sages there; it's some of the same sages that move from Israel to Babylon, but they have the final word on a lot of these matters, and that's why the Babylonian Talmud is the much more popular one. It's why that's the one that's on my shelf, and I don't own a copy of the Jerusalem Talmud. You can buy it, but I personally don't own a copy. So I want to talk about Bavel, and I want to talk about the Talmudic era that happens in Babylon. You can see a map of it on page 122. We're going to do more about that in a moment. But I want to open our conversation about Bavel with a very special quote from the Babylonian Talmud. Dave, do you have your book?
I do.
Okay, so if you can read for us, please, on page 123, text 1, charitable dispersion.
Charitable dispersion. Rabbi Ashi taught, the Holy One, blessed be he, acted charitable with the people of Israel by scattering them among the nations.
Who is Rabbi Oshaya? Thank you, Dave, for reading from him. Rabbi Oshaya was one of the students of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Prince, one of the compilers, or the main compiler or redactor of the Mishnah. He did this with a group of people. They were known as Minyana de Rebbe. It was about 11 people did it together with him. But Rabbi Oshaya is one of the students of Rabbeinu Yehuda Hanassi. So he's aware of this need for Mishnah, this need for writing down of the oral law. And then he's part of that first group that is analyzing the Mishnah. Now, what I think is so important about what he says is he says this way before Constantine converts to Christianity and the persecution in Israel becomes so hard pressed that lots of Jews migrate to Babylon. But I want you to understand that if you fast forward to the year 300 CE, many years after Rabbi Oshaya teaches his teaching in text 1, think about how much you would have resonated with this statement. This is an interesting statement. He's saying that God did a favor to the Jewish people and he dispersed them all around the world. What he's essentially saying is, imagine living in 300 CE, 350 CE, and you're fleeing Roman persecution in Israel. And obviously, as Jews, whenever we flee, especially if there's only one group of Jews, you're worried about the oral Torah. Imagine, just like in Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's time, they were worried about this. So imagine being aware that even though you're fleeing Roman persecution right now, in Babylon they're safe and they're continuing this tradition. Right? Now today, unfortunately, I guess, or fortunately, if you're viewing it through the lens of text 1, our portfolio has been diversified so much that we're all over the world. So if Jews in America are persecuted to one degree or another, then Jews in France are not. And Jews in France and Jews in Germany and think about World War II. When there were Jews that were living in Israel, there were Jews that were living in the U.S. while the atrocities of the Holocaust were going on in Germany. That's basically what text 1 is saying. So basically, I guess what I'm trying to say is even after the rigorous Gemara analysis that was the Jerusalem Talmud came to a premature end in around the beginning of the 4th century, the Babylonian process continued. And it continued all the way up until about the late 5th century. So let's give it right around the year 500. that the Babylonian Talmud gets compiled or collected into what today is known as the Talmud Bavli or the Babylonian Talmud. Now, if we're going to talk about Bavel, we really ought to start getting a little bit more of a detailed understanding of what was going on in Bavel in during this time. Who were the main leaders? What cities were they in? What was the purpose of these yeshivas? How did these yeshivas get started? And how were they going about analyzing the Talmud? And for this, we have a video. So I will ask you to please turn your attention to the video screens for a brief history of the Jews of Babylon.
By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we recalled Zion. How can we sing God's song in a foreign land? So lamented the Jews in the 5th century BCE as the Babylonians conquered ancient Israel, carted the majority of its population into captivity, and deposited them in Nahado along the Euphrates' eastern flank. They had hauled stones and soil from Jerusalem's Temple Mount into exile.
I don't see any video.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
To build a
Thank you for that.
in Nahado.
I don't either.
Okay, thank you for that. I don't know why that is. Give me a second. I will start again. Share. Your screen sharing is paused. Why is that? The video thumbnails are minimized. Very interesting. Stop share. Share screen. Why does it say your screen sharing is paused? I don't understand. Resume. Your screen sharing is paused. Resume. Anybody have any ideas? Show meeting.
Just a dark blue screen with nothing on it.
Yeah.
Go to your settings and give permission, maybe.
No, I have the permission. That's not the problem. I was just sharing. You guys saw the slides up until now, right?
Yes.
Right? So
Why is it paused? Good question.
maybe let's try here. Let's do this. Let's do here. You guys can see now, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
So far, so good. Let's do stop share. Let's do share screen. And let's try again with the screen. See that now it's paused. For some reason, when it comes to doing the audio or the video or something, it's not letting me. Let's see if we just do.
Yeah,
Well,
the
we
audio
hear the
is okay.
audio.
There's just no video.
Yeah, there's no video.
Okay,
We hear
that's
the
fine.
audio.
Let's try. So you guys see it now, correct?
No, there's a black screen.
Just a black
Right.
screen.
Right, but you see.
Okay.
Do you see it now?
No. Now we see it.
Now we see it.
Okay, so let's try again. Can you hear? Give me a thumbs
Yes.
up if you can hear the audio of the video. Okay, perfect.
By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we recalled Zion. How can we sing God's song in a foreign land? So lamented the Jews in the 5th century BCE as the Babylonians conquered ancient Israel, carted the majority of its population into captivity, and deposited them in Nahado along the Euphrates' eastern flank. They had hauled stones and soil from Jerusalem's Temple Mount into exile, and they used these materials to build a synagogue in Nahado. They called it Shaf V'Yatev, the slipped and settled synagogue. God's temple had fallen, but the divine presence accompanied the Jews into exile, and it would now find a station in Babylon itself. Babylon fell to Persia, and just 70 years after the temple's destruction, the edict of Persian King Cyrus allowed Jews to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple. Still, a large Jewish population remained. A 3 weeks journey divides Nahado and Jerusalem. The two Jewish centers kept in regular communication, and the exiled community proved a vital safe space for Judaism when Roman persecution in the Holy Land became unbearably brutal. At the beginning of the 3rd century, a leading Nahadon sage named Shmuel rose to prominence. A brilliant Torah scholar, expert in natural sciences, including medicine, astronomy, and biology, and a Jewish judge with extensive experience in the application of civil and criminal Torah law. Under his guidance, Torah study blossomed. Another great Babylonian scholar was Abba Aricha, meaning Abba the Tall. Better known as Rav, his name appears throughout the Talmud. Rav spent time in Israel and participated in compiling the Mishnah. After returning to Babylon, he established an academy in the city of Sura, 30 miles south of Nahado, along the Euphrates, close to the ancient city of Babylon. This move was calculated. Sura's large Jewish population was not particularly observant, and Rav felt that a local study center would boost Torah observance. After Rav and Shmuel's passing in the mid-3rd century, their disciples maintained the momentum. In the north, Shmuel's area, they had major academies in Nahado, Pompadissa, and Mechoza. In the south, Rav's territory, academies flourished in Sura, Masamachazia, and Narash. By the mid-4th century, Roman persecution in the Holy Land made it impossible for Torah scholarship to survive, and most of its leading sages escaped to the safety of the rivers of Babylon. At that point, Babylon became the undisputed center of Jewish life and Torah scholarship, an honor that continued for centuries to come.
So that's kind of a brief overview of what's going on in Bavel over this 500-year period, or 600-year period. Why? Because it really starts with the destruction of the first temple, right? Okay. Then the rebuilding of the second temple, but many Jews stay. And then it moves on from there. So they picked, where they started was with Rav and Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel are right after the redaction of, or even during the redaction of the Mishnah. And these are the first two characters that we are introduced to. And you can follow along. He really went through the whole timeline that you have on page 124. He already did that. But if you follow along, you'll see that it really goes kind of one generation at a time. You start with Rav and Shmuel, right? And Rav and Shmuel are the first two major sages to lead Torah study, the Gemara analysis that's going on in Bavel. And they found the first two. You can see this in the first row of the timeline on page 124, right? You see Rav and Shmuel. Both die in the middle of the 3rd century. Both pass away in the middle of the 3rd century. And they found the first two academies in Bavel, namely Sura and Narda. Now, in their period, there's wonderful Torah analysis, Gemara analysis going on in Israel, particularly in the city of Tiberias, right? As we move through the generations, you see that it continues, and then eventually the Israel yeshivot kind of taper off, and the Babylonian ones take over. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about Rav and Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel were such tremendous scholars that even though they lived at the same time as Torah scholarship is going on in Israel, you would imagine that Israel was always on a higher playing field. Still, the sages of Israel recognized the brilliance that was Rav and Shmuel. In fact, text 2, which Ron, if I can ask you to read it for us, please, is Rabbi Yochanan. Not text 2. They don't have it here as a text, but in the Talmud in Chulin, Rabbi Yochanan refers to Rav and Shmuel as my masters in the East. In other words, he's referring to Babylon, to Babylonian scholars, and saying that they are superior to him. He's calling them my masters, which I think says a lot about Rav and Shmuel. There are hundreds of halachic discussions where Rav has one opinion and Shmuel has another opinion. That's part of Gemara analysis, obviously. And the students of these great sages recognize that they each had a greatness in a different area. Ron, if you can read for us, please, text 2, ruling rules.
In every instance of disagreement between Rav and Shmuel, the halakha accords with Rav's opinion regarding ritual matters and with Shmuel's opinion regarding monetary matters.
What I think I'd really like the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think this shows you a lot of how related to the history the scholarship is. Why do you think, with regards to Rav, ritual observance, with regards to ritual observance, Rav's opinion is always followed, and with regards to civil law, Shmuel's opinion is always followed? Let me explain. Rav was greater than Shmuel in terms of his let's call it tradition, his line of tradition. Rav, according to some opinions, in some instances, is even considered a Tana, which is a Mishnaic sage, right? Which obviously has superiority. He assisted Rabbi Yehuda in compiling the Mishnah, right? So obviously, he's going to have superiority when it comes to things like ritual observance, which are largely tradition dependent. But let's talk about civil law, right? The Torah has all sorts of laws about torts, about damages, about all sorts of, right, and compensation, and all sorts of opinions like that, and contracts. Shmuel, remember, Shmuel completely studied in Babylon. Now, Babylon might have been lower when it came to, let's say, the line of tradition or their spiritual level, but they had a very big upper hand. They have a very different set of circumstances when it came to civil law, and that is that in Israel, the Jews are under persecution. Even if they're not under persecution, they were certainly under Roman rulership. So with regards to civil law, the Romans did not allow them to have their own independent court systems that would rule about these things. So you had to follow Roman law. But if you're talking about in Babylon, the opposite was true. In Babylon, they had something that was known as the Reish Galuta. The Reish Galuta was the exilarch, a governmentally recognized a position, which was the leader of the Jewish people. It actually started with the exiled kings from after the destruction of the first temple, and eventually that was a whole line of political leaders of the Jewish people, and they had a court system which the Jewish people actually followed. Now, why do I say this to you? Because Shmuel, in other words, when Rav is practicing these laws in Israel or studying these laws in Israel, it's largely theoretical because they're not even being allowed to exercise those laws. But Shmuel is actually exercising civil law, so that's why they have these kind of two different rules, if you will, who we follow when it comes to these two different opinions. Okay. Under Rav and Shmuel and their successors, the yeshivot in Bavel attracted tremendous scholars. If you keep going down to the next row on page 124, you will see that one of the greatest scholars is a man by the name of Rav Huna. Another one is Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda founds the next big academy in the south, which is called Pumbedisa. Pumbedisa actually is founded, I guess Rabbi Yehuda passes away at the end of the 3rd century, so let's say mid-3rd century is when the yeshiva in Pumbedisa is founded. It actually lasts all the way until the year 1038. 800 years. Is that wild? 800 years this yeshiva in Babylon was still functioning, and only 1,000 years ago. Was it destroyed, which could be a story for another time. Anyways, another one of the great sages is Rav Huna. Rav Huna, with both of these, Rav Yehuda, Rav Huna, Rav Chizda, all three of these fellows that you see that are the main Amoraim, or Gemara scholars, in this next era of Gemara analysis. Every one of them was a student of both Rav and Shmuel. Not difficult because it was only about a 3 weeks journey between, about a 30-mile journey between the two. Between the northern and the southern parts of the Bavel area, both between these two rivers, right, the Euphrates and the Tigris. And Rav Huna had a tremendous study hall. He learned by Rav and Shmuel, and he really built a following of students. Anybody want to give a guess how many students Rav Huna had? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Come on.
2,000.
You're probably low. We don't know the number, but here's what we do know. We know that Rav Huna had
10,000.
I don't know. I don't know the exact number, but it's probably somewhere between 2 and 10,000. Let me give you what we do know. Rav Huna had 13 metargimim. Okay, metargimim were these broadcasters. So imagine a time before microphones, right? And you're talking to a large crowd. How far can your voice travel, right? Even if you have a nice projecting voice like I do, how far can you go? 100, 200 people without a microphone, right? 300 people maybe? I don't think you can do more than 300, 400 people, right? I think that's kind of your max. They had these metargimim, which were basically broadcasters that they would listen to Rav Huna saying his, and they would broadcast it further. Isn't that wild? Like a human microphone. They would also help to clarify it. They had to be sages and scholars in their own right. He had 13 of them. So how many students did there? I don't know, but it was definitely thousands and thousands. So much so that take a look at text 3. Phil, you want to read it for us? Rising with the dust.
3. After listening to lectures in the yeshiva of Rav Huna, the assembled sages would rise and dust off their cloaks. The dust would rise and block out the sun. They would exclaim in the west, i.e., in the land of Israel, upon seeing a large dust cloud in the distance, they've just arisen in the academy of Rav Huna the Babylonian.
So in other words, the dust cloud was so large that they were able to see it in Israel. So how many people were there? I don't know, but definitely thousands like that. When they were getting up, there was a commotion going on. By the way, in case you're wondering if this was something that the secular crowd was aware of, they were. Rav Huna had another practice. It was called Yarchei Kala. Yarchei Kala would happen in the summer. So you got to imagine that in Babylon, not everybody is a Torah scholar, right? There's many thousands of them, but there's also other folks. Many of them were farmers, and tens of thousands of farmers would leave their work to study Torah specifically for 2 months of the year, corresponding basically to August and September of our year. These were months that were pre-harvest, but after, I guess it was, for some reason, it was downtime in the agricultural season, and they had these gatherings they would hold, which were called Yarchei Kala. And Yarchei Kala gatherings were so large that actually Rabbi Bar Nachmoni, who was the successor of Rabbi Yehuda, right? So now we're on the next row, the third row of our timeline on page 124. Rabbi Bar Nachmoni actually had to run from the government because they accused him of withholding tax from the government, because he would hold these massive gatherings where tens of thousands of farmers would come to study Torah in his academy in the summer or at the end of the summer, and they weren't working, and as a result not paying taxes, and they were upset about this. So there was a lot going on. Anyways, I want to fast forward with you to a very important time and also a very important moment in terms of how the Gemara is going to become actually compiled and put down and for us to have today. But that is Abaya and Rava. So Abaya and Rava are the third row. So I guess we're not really fast forwarding that much on our timeline. And they are two of the greatest sages, but something interesting happens at the time of Abaya and Rava. Remember, what's going on at the time until the time of Abaya and Rava is the Gemara analysis. What is Gemara analysis? You ask lots of questions on the Mishnah in order to clarify, in order to get down to the truth of it, but you also compare it to, anybody remember, we learned about them last week? Braitas. Braitas are like the extended cut of the Mishnah. Beautiful. So you constantly compare between the two of them. Now, where are you getting these braitas from? It turns out the braitas that they had at that time were of varying traditions. Depending who your teacher was, depending which city you lived in, depending what year you lived in, was which traditions of braitas you had, and you used those in order to analyze the Mishnah and get down to the truth of what the Mishnah is trying to say. But it turns out that there were a lot of different versions of those. In the times of Abaya and Rava, something interesting happens. Elise, if you can read for us, please, text 4. Combining schools. So it's important to understand, we're not talking yet about any sort of writing. It's not being written down yet. But there will be a combining that is step 1 towards the writing. Go ahead.
All right. Until the period of Abaye and Rava, students studied exclusively the branches of tradition that they received from their own teachers, precisely as it was recited to them. As a result, some students only studied the tradition according to Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Oshia. Other students studied it only according to the Mishnah of Bar Kapada, others according to the Beirotot of the house of Levi, or the Beirotot of the house of Shmuel, and so on. During the era of Abaye and Rava and forever after, students were introduced to the method of studying all of their diverse views. They studied all of the Bareot they taught and resolved and reconciled their discrepancies until they were no longer contradictory. In the course of this process, they succeeded in extracting many laws, clarifying many teachings, and uncovering their true intentions.
So this is a fascinating step towards the Gemara, as you can imagine. Why? Because if you have many different braitas and you're not sure which ones of them actually hold up against the Mishnah, which ones don't, and everybody's doing this on different levels, it's going to be very hard to collect all that. But what happens is, at the time of Abaye and Rava, and it's not entirely clear why this happens during the time of Abaye and Rava, I can suggest two things. First of all, during the time of Abaye and Rava, they live at that time after the Jerusalem Talmud is done. There's no longer analysis happening in Jerusalem, and all of those scholars, whichever one survived, came down to Babylon. Right? So you automatically have one place. There's another thing. After Rav Chizda passes away and is succeeded by Rav Huna, the sages of Bavel now become consolidated in the yeshivas, in the yeshiva Pumbedisa. In other words, basically, there were the other yeshivas were still going on, but there were representatives of every school of thought happening in Pumbedisa, in the same academy. Never mind the same city, in the same academy. That's important because even though they were close to each other, they were only 30 miles away from each other in Babylon. But there could have been two different conversations going on at the same time, or even a couple weeks apart. But there could have been different conversations going on that weren't necessarily consolidated. Once they all become consolidated in the yeshiva of Abaye and Rava, they start to compare them. And they start to compare these different Braita traditions and to realize which one is the correct one. In other words, what they're doing is they're kind of picking up the pieces of an oral tradition that's kind of been all over the place, and now has all become centralized, almost similar to the time of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, at the times of the Mishnah, but you'll see that it gets even better in the times of those that actually redact the Gemara, or whatever compile the Gemara. I guess my point is, this is the first step towards a Gemara, because you have one voice, you have one academy, and they're comparing all of them and turning them into one voice. That's why you find that Abaye and Rava's names are those that are mentioned the most in the Gemara. Abaye's name is mentioned over 400 times. Rava's name appears more than 2,000 times throughout the Gemara. And they often argue with each other, obviously. When it comes to the halacha, in other words, the way to follow, the halacha follows Abaye. He passed away before Rava, so Rava is kind of the leader voice. And the halacha follows Rava every time except for 6 cases. Any Talmudic scholar can tell you, not necessarily what they are, but the term Ya'al Kagam, which is 6 Hebrew letters, which stand for the 6 cases in which the halacha follows Abaye instead of following Rava. Okay. Let's move down to the bottom of the timeline that we've been following on page 124. Okay, we're going to arrive at the yeshiva of Pumbedisa, because that becomes a central yeshiva towards the end of the time of the Gemara. And towards the end of Rava's death, one of his disciples, whose name is Rav Papa, founds a yeshiva in a southern town which was called Narash. Okay, so that's near Surah. Pumbedisa is still going on, but he does found this yeshiva. Shortly afterward, a great sage whose name was Rav Ashi begins to become both the rabbinic, in other words, scholarly leader, and the political leader of the Jews of Babylon. He builds a yeshiva in another city, which is called Masa Mechasia. You can see when that one appears on the timeline. It's on the second to last, on the third to last, so the 4th row from the top. On the timeline on page 124, he founds this yeshiva in Masa Mechasia. Now, Rav Ashi's yeshiva functioned until his death in 427. In all, he reigned for about 60 years. Okay, and during the 60 years that he reigns, so to speak, the study was really centralized under his leadership, and he had a very rigorous and very organized way of doing study. What was that? There are roughly 60 tractates in the Talmud. He had a systematic way that his yeshiva basically went through all of the tractates of the Talmud, 2 tractates per year. Okay, remember, there's scholars and lay people from all over Babylon at this point, and there's nothing going on in Israel. So it's very centralized, and twice per year, he would have a gathering, and they would go through one of the tractates. And they would summarize everything that Abaye and Rava had done to create one voice. They would summarize it all. Okay, and he did this 2 times. In other words, it took 30 years to go through the entirety of the Mishnah. And then he did this a second time for another 30 years. And over the course of those 60 years, they came up with what today we're going to call the Gemara. He did this together with another great sage. His name was Ravina. And this is possible, like last time, for a combination of three reasons. Number one is Rav Ashi is the first one scholar to lead for such a long period, for 60 years. Number two, he, as I mentioned earlier, he has the Jewish leadership, in other words, the scholarly academic leadership. He also has political leadership. So that allows him to do that. Number three, as usual, the only time that such a monumental project is really possible is when you're during a time of peace. The Jewish community at that time of Babylon, led by Rav Ashi, has a very, very good relationship with the Sassanid king and the Sassanid empire, which is the empire that's kind of leading in the whole area, but specifically for our what's most relevant to our conversation in Babylon. And what he does is text 5. I think we're back at the beginning. Dave, if you can read for us, please. Text 5, compiling the Talmud. Dave, you want to read?
Yep. Rav Ashi and Ravina arranged the teachings of the Amoraim that preceded them. They organized them according to the order of the tractates, placing each teaching next to the appropriate and relevant Mishnah. Along with the contemporary Amoraim, Rav Ashi and Ravina posed necessary questions and provided appropriate solutions. They establish all of this in Gemara.
Okay. After Rav Ashi's passings, the conditions, the amazing conditions which led to them being able to do what they did, deteriorated. And it's so interesting to me that both the Mishnah and the Gemara, it's almost like Hashem carved out a window of like a peaceful period of 50, 60 years to allow the Mishnah to come, 50, 60 years to allow the Gemara to come, 500 years apart, obviously. But it's fascinating to me that it's just like what we call them flukes in history, but it's obviously the hand of God that really wants the oral tradition to be kept alive, and that's what happens. Anyways, even after Rav Ashi's passing, this work continued, this monumental composition continued to accumulate. The vast majority of the text, however, was set in place by Rav Ashi. Some of it continued later. We don't have exact years for everything, but basically, certainly by the year 500 of the Common Era, we already have the entire text 95% identical to the Gemara that we have today. There might have been little additions afterwards, but for the most part, that's when it ends. So right around the year 500, about 1500 years ago, is when the Talmud is set in place. Now we understand something about how the Talmud came about. In other words, like the history of it. I want to move on a little bit to talking about what they did and how the actual content. We spoke a lot about it last week, but I want to continue to talk about it. And before we do so, we have to do something important, which is called chazara, or review. But it looks like Dave has a question. So before we go into it.
Was there any debate when they said an interpretation? Was that it? That was no discussion? Or once they would make an interpretation, was there kind of an academic process of debating it to make sure everybody signed on?
Okay, I think you're making a wrong assumption, which I was actually going to correct soon. And it's an assumption a lot of people make. People make an assumption that the Gemara is exactly like the Mishnah. The Mishnah was a book of law. And people make an assumption that the Gemara was also a book of law. The Gemara is not a book of law. It's not just another book of law that's a couple hundred years later that is like kind of the next version of it. The Gemara is a summary of conversations that happened between Gemara sages. So, yes, there definitely is disagreement, and that disagreement often is put down into the Gemara. And we have those disagreements. There's many, many, thousands and thousands of disagreements in the Gemara that we then have a way that we follow, but that doesn't, as we discussed last week, it doesn't take away from the value that there is in that disagreement, in that diversity of opinion.
Thank you.
Okay. So before I make some observations about the way that they actually put this all down into a book, I think we have to do something called chazara. Chazara is the Hebrew word for review. And I think it's a very important thing to understand about learning Gemara, that a proper student reviews their study. Ron, if you can read for me, please, text 6 about the importance of scholarly review.
If he is a Torah scholar, a Talmud Chacham, this refers to those who are consistent in their study, constantly reviewing their lessons.
In other words, he says that in order to be called a Jewish scholar, you have to be somebody who's reviewing your lessons. There's no such thing as, oh, I went through the entire Gemara, I did it once, great, and now I know what there is to be said. It's actually the exact opposite. The importance of review, the importance of there's a song that's playing in my head that people sing. Chazara, Chazara, Nacham al Chazara. You review it and you review it and you review it again. Shows on the importance that we've always placed on tradition and on the understanding of what has been said in previous generations before we could actually understand it and move on from there and build on that, as we're going to discuss in lesson 6. So before we keep going, I'd like to do a review with you of what we studied last week. Yes? Everybody with me? Okay. I hope you're not going to have some PTSD, but last week, here's what we did. Okay. If you'd like to follow with the exercises, I'm not really going to do the exercises, but let me just break it down for you. If you remember, in last week's sugya, which was a Gemara analysis of the Mishnah, we were trying to understand one thing: who is the opinion of our Mishnah? And step 1 of the 6-step sugya basically introduced a braita, which showed us that the Mishnah is not consistent with either of two opinions, right? Because the Mishnah seems to be implying that you cannot eat on the afternoon before the Passover Seder in order to have a hearty appetite for that night, but that on Shabbat and other holidays you would be allowed to. That doesn't seem to be consistent with either of the two opinions in our braita, which was Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you wouldn't be allowed to eat on the afternoon before any Shabbat or any holiday, including Passover. And according to Rabbi Yossi, you would be allowed to eat on the afternoon before any Shabbat or any holiday, including Passover. So it doesn't really seem to work with either of them. This was addressed by two different opinions, right? Again, you can go through the exercises if you'd like, and you can summarize it as you're going through. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go through it here on the screen. This was, a solution was proposed by two different individuals, namely Rav Huna and then Rav Papa. Solution number 1 of Rav Huna was, let's challenge our assumption of Rabbi Yossi. We assumed that Rabbi Yossi was making a blanket statement and that you're allowed to eat on the afternoon before, and we assumed that applied to Shabbat and all holidays. He says, maybe let's put a little asterisk on Yossi and let's say he means Shabbat and all holidays besides for Passover. The reason for that would be because Passover has this special mitzvah of matzah, and therefore on the afternoon before that one, you're not allowed to eat in order to have a hearty appetite for the matzah. In this way, we can make our Mishnah work with Rabbi Yossi. That was step 2, solution number 1. Step 3 was solution number 2. This comes from Rav Papa. He says, let's go the exact opposite way. Why don't we suggest that maybe we misunderstood Rav Yehuda? We assumed that Rav Yehuda was saying that across the board, you're not allowed to eat on the afternoon before, Shabbat, holidays, Passover, all of them, you're not allowed to eat the afternoon before from 3:30, which is the mincha time. He says maybe that's true about all of them, except for Passover, when he would say that it's from 3 o'clock, which is close to the mincha time. Again, because of this the specialty of the mitzvah of matzah, you stop eating a little earlier, maybe half an hour earlier. Beautiful. So based on this, the Mishnah could be the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Okay. The Gemara then introduces a second braita. This second braita is similar to the first braita, except that it specifies that we're talking about 9 hours into the day, which, if you remember, is 3 o'clock, namely close to the time of mincha, and not 3:30, which is the actual time of mincha. Based on that, you cannot distinguish between Rabbi Yehuda, between Passover and the rest, because it seems that the time is always 3 o'clock, no matter what. Beautiful. So then the Mishnah would follow the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara's next move is to say, hold on a second. And this was Mar Zutra who did this. He says, who said that second braita is reliable? Maybe the second braita is not reliable, right? And if so, then you can go back to assuming that our Mishnah is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. And finally, the Gemara finishes off by saying, Ameimar tells us that he personally heard the braita, and he heard it from, recounted in front of a great sage named Rabbi Pinchas ben Abami, and therefore the second braita stands. And as a result, our Mishnah can only be the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. In this 6-step process, what's happened is the opinion has gone back and forth, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, and finally we have established that our Mishnah is indeed the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. This concludes our review of this sugya, of this Gemara conversation. Okay. Now, when Rav Ashi began to compile this conversation, because that whole conversation you've read essentially is Rav Ashi and Ravina that put this down on paper for you, right? Beautiful. So this is my first opportunity to point something very interesting out to you, right? When Rav Ashi began the project of writing the Gemara, he likely did not think of himself as writing a book. I think that's very, very important to understand. Instead, he viewed himself as summarizing a conversation, all right? So again, this is such a great slide, I'm going to do it again. He likely viewed himself as summarizing questions and answers and statements and attacks from different places into one coherent conversation. So instead of thinking of the Gemara as a book of law or as a composition or compilation of any sort, the best thing to look at the Gemara is as a summary of conversations that happened over many centuries in many different cities, okay? The best way to point this out to you is to talk about Rav Huna and Rav Papa, right? Anybody want to guess what's so interesting about the conversation that we just summarized from last week's lesson? What's so interesting about Rav Huna and Rav Papa arguing with each other? Rav Huna suggested one solution, Rav Papa suggested another solution. Anybody want to hazard a guess? What's so interesting about it? Let me tell you what's so interesting about it. That conversation could have never happened. Anybody want to guess why?
They didn't live at the same time.
Very good. They lived 100 years apart. Rav Huna passed away in the year 280 to the Common Era, and Rav Papa passed away in the year 350 to the Common Era. They lived a century apart from each other, okay? They also were preaching in two different academies. Rav Huna lived in Surah. Rav Papa was preaching in Narash. So it's not just... Now, the statement, Amar Rav Huna, and then the words that Rav Huna said. Amar Rav Huna means Rav Huna said, right? And then the words that he said. And the statement, Amar Rav Papa said, and then the words that he said. Those are both true statements. Rav Ashi lifted those two, but because they were both talking about the same topic, he put them one after the other as if it's a coherent conversation. How fascinating is that? They live in different cities. They live in different eras, but he's taking them and compiling them and turning them into one coherent conversation, which, by the way, shows you one of the most brilliant things of the Talmud, of the Gemara, which is that it presents itself as if it's a coherent conversation. Trust me, if you would have walked over to me when I was in yeshiva, 14 years old, 15 years old, maybe I was learning this Gemara. Actually, this Gemara I think I learned for the first time when I was 20. But even when I was 20, if you would have come over to me and said, Rav Huna and Rav Papa, are they talking to each other? I probably would have said yes, because that's the way it presents itself in the Gemara. But as you start to unpack the history behind it, you start to realize, no, not at all. He's presenting it as one conversation in order that you have all the different opinions and in one conversation on the same topic. But the real only unifying factor is that they're both talking about the same topic, not the time and not the place. To the best of my knowledge, no other book in history works that way. Now, in addition to that, by the way, you see sometimes the gaps. You see sometimes the gaps in the coherency. I guess the gaps in the copy paste, like in the connections. Rav Ashi did his best to make it one coherent conversation, but every once in a while you have a situation where that doesn't happen. In Appendix B of our lesson, which I do not recommend you go to right now, but they bring a whole conversation, and essentially what happens is like this. Let me pull down the slides because it's not so relevant to what we're talking about right now. Essentially what happens is like this. The Gemara brings a Mishnah, brings a question on the Mishnah, answers the question on the Mishnah. Beautiful. Then the Gemara brings a question on a Braita. And trust me, I've encountered this in the Gemara. And the Gemara asks the question on the Braita, and you're like, hold on a second. The answer you just gave to the issue in our Mishnah would work for our Braita. So why are you asking this question right after it? But when you understand that it's not one conversation, it's basically, that's one of the times that you kind of see, ooh, I can see the connection point. I can see the gap between the two conversations that Rav Ashi is trying to present to me as one, that the Gemara is trying to present to me as one conversation. You can see that it's not really. It's just a fascinating thing you can see every once in a while while you're learning Gemara. And this is observed by Harry Friedman in his biography on the Talmud. It's text 7. Phil, can you read for us, please?
For all its complex composition, the Talmud appears to the reader to be a seamless work. It's not until we analyze it closely that we can see the joints between the layers. Although written in Babylon, the Talmud can quote the opinion of people who lived their whole lives elsewhere, yet it will feel as if they were standing in the same rooms as native Babylonians.
Which is a fascinating cut. So then this helps us understand that Rav Ashi didn't view himself as writing a book, but rather as kind of the keeper of the records, the collector of the records of all the conversations, the minutes of the meetings of all the different Gemara sages that lived up until his time. Another fascinating thing that you see is that there's this obsession in the Talmud with who said what. Okay? Attribution is meticulously maintained. This statement was said by Rav Papa, this statement was said by Rav Huna, this statement was said by this one, etc. And sometimes it's not just one person, it's more than one. Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav. Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, his teacher. The reason these attributions are so important is because you're not writing a book. You're trying to collect the records. So the line of tradition is very important. Very often the Gemara will include multiple layers. Oh, this person said the name of that person who was the son of that person who said the name of this person. Right? The most extreme one of these is text 8. You can see it in front of you. I'm going to read it. Rabbi Shimon bar Zvid. Rabbi Shimon bar Zvid said that Rabbi Yitzchak bar Tavla said that Rabbi Chia Aricha of the school of Rabbi Acha said that Rabbi Zera said that Rabbi Elazar said that Rabbi Chanina said that Rabbi Miyasha said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilahi, and then it goes on to say the statement. What is the significance of the phrase "Fear my name"? In the verse, but for you that fear my name, the Son of Righteousness will arise with healing in its wings. It refers to people who are afraid to mention God's name in vain. What's going on here? Like, seriously, the composition, the book that we call the Gemara could be at least 10% smaller, if not 20% smaller, if all the names would just be eliminated. Just tell me the things that they're saying. I trust you. That's not the way Rav Ashi compiled his book. He was meticulous about who said what in order to as we're going to see later, in order to keep those things, that part of the tradition alive, like that. First of all, we can compare different traditions that were said in the same person's name to each other. That's going to become very important, right? So it's important to know who said what. It's also going to become important in terms of ruling halacha. Remember we said Rav and Shmuel had different personalities, historically, where they were and how they were studying. As a result, we follow the law, the rule of law follows a different one depending on which topic you're talking about. So the names become very, very important. Okay. All right. When Rav Ashi and his colleagues embarked on the mission of compiling the Gemara, they had a very, very formidable task, and I want to explain why. The Mishnah, as we saw, was redacted. That was really put together by one person and his team of people. They were putting together the Mishnah. They were creating halacha. They were trying to give you laws. It was redacted from many other laws, and they definitely ruled laws. They chose halachas, etc., etc. But it was, for the most part, one work of law, right? So he was able to say, here are the 6 orders. Here are the 63 tractates. This is how I'm going to organize it. And that's how I organize it. Beautiful. Now, are they broad categories? Yes, they are. We saw. Okay? But Rav Ashi was doing something different. Rav Ashi was summarizing conversations. And as a result, he had lots of stuff that wasn't going to fit neatly into all of these different, categories that they had. Which is why you find in the Gemara that this long, meandering conversation that he's trying to formulate, which is really across centuries and across continents and not continents, but across countries. When he does that, he often needs to have the conversation kind of follow a thread or a river that can be very, very much meandering and split into different topics and then come back together, etc. Why? In order to preserve lots of different elements of the conversation. Dave, you want to read for us, please? Text 9, purposeful digressions.
Wait a minute, I think. The focus of attention may shift from subject to subject until we find ourselves far from the original starting point. However, it is guided by an inner connection, sometimes very subtle, but often very strong, between all the subjects discussed. This connection is never merely superficial, and the seemingly wayward digressions, in fact, add substance and interest to the central theme.
Thank you. So, in other words, this conversation will not always follow directly, like, let's say the conversation we just had seemed very, very well, the way he put it together, very coherent, right? They're all discussing the Mishnah, they're comparing it to Braitas. This is a very normal conversation that they're having about it, right? Let me keep going with you through that Gemara, okay? We're not going to read all the words, we're not going to read all the texts. I want you to understand what happens for about the next 22 pages, I think it is. Let me just see so I can remember the exact amount. 15. For 15 pages. Let me summarize for you what happens for 15 pages after the sugya that we learned last week about whether you're allowed to eat on the afternoon before the Passover Seder or not. Okay? As we saw, this chapter opens up with the main law. Are you allowed to eat on the afternoon before Passover? Seeing as you're going to be eating matzah that night, we want you to have a good appetite for it. Beautiful. From the main law, the Gemara asks a question. Okay, I get it. You're not supposed to eat a meal in the afternoon before Shabbat, right? Because as we saw, that kind of happened already. All right. What about if I started my meal earlier in the morning? Let's say Friday morning, way before 3 o'clock. But my meal was such a good meal, it was such a big party, maybe it was a bar mitzvah or a wedding or something, that the meal ran from 12 o'clock, from maybe 8 o'clock in the morning, all the way into sunset, right? What's the question? The question is, what do I do now about the prohibition to eat? And what do I do about Friday Kiddush, right? Normally, you're not eating then you're having Friday afternoon or evening services, and then you're having a Kiddush and a meal, right? When do you make Kiddush if you're in the middle of your meal already? When do you do the afternoon and the evening prayers if you're in the middle of a meal already, right? That's the next conversation that the Talmud has. Okay, then the Talmud has a different question. Who even said Kiddush needs to be connected to a meal, right? Like, we all think of it that way, right? Kiddush, and then you have your Friday night Shabbat dinner, right? Or Kiddush, then you have your Shabbat afternoon lunch, or your Passover Seder. It always begins with Kiddush, and then there's a meal. Who said the two are related? So the Gemara has a long conversation about that. From that, they move into a whole different unrelated conversation, which is a blessing when moving during a meal, all right? Let's say you've sat down, you've washed, you're having your meal in one room, and now you're moving to a different room to continue your meal, right? Does the blessing count? Do I need to wash again? Do I need to do the grace of the meals in between, etc.? What about a meal that runs into Havdalah? You can see we got a little bit more back on topic now. We had a meal that ran into Shabbat. What about a meal that runs into Havdalah? I started my afternoon lunch on Shabbat afternoon, but it kept going for so long. It's a nice, wonderful bar mitzvah, lots of guests, everybody's enjoying each other's company, and now it's Havdalah time. I have to have a cup of wine for the grace after meals. I have to have a cup of wine for Havdalah. Can I use the same cup? What if I only have enough wine for one cup? Which one takes precedence? Is the grace after meals more important, or is Havdalah more important? From this, it moves on to a conversation in general about different laws of Kiddush and Havdalah. What type of wine do we have to use? What time does it need to happen? What's the source of Kiddush? What's the source of Havdalah? And in this way, the Gemara moves on and on and on from one conversation to another conversation. Even if it's slightly off topic, it does this back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And this is how you end up with, in the middle of the laws of Passover, a 15-page sugya that much of which is discussing Kiddush and Havdalah, which has nothing to do with Passover, right? So Rav Ashi allowed this to happen, and he said that's fine as long as it's one meandering conversation. The joints don't have to be tight; they can be loose connections, and I'm fine with that. As part of that, all throughout the Talmud, you have something called Agadata. It's your next key term. It's on page 139. The Agadata are all the other conversations that happen between everything, right? Let me ask you a question. What we've just discussed is a meandering stream of thought that all is discussing laws. Where in there do you have room, for example, for a statement like Siyag lachach mashtika, that being quiet is a good attribute for the wise. In other words, will lead to you being wise. You know, being quiet and listening. That's just a nice moral and ethical teaching, right? That's part of a category that we call Agadata. Agadata literally means, oh, sorry, these are the questions. But if you take a look on page 139, Agadata literally means that which has been related. And it refers to all of the teachings that were not halachic, per se. It's not teaching you a law per se, that the sages of the Mishnah and Gemara said. Let me give you an example of how one of them arrives, okay? And then we're going to start to talk about why it exists in the Gemara. In other words, we have to answer some questions about Agadata. Why would Rav Ashi even include it in the Gemara, right? But we'll talk about that soon. Before we do, let me give you an example of an Agadata in front of you, okay? As you can imagine, this Agadata comes in the middle of those 15 pages that I just summarized for you, right? It's in the Talmud, in Tractate Pesachim, it's text 10. It's page 112a, right? Our sugya that we learned last week started on page 99. This is in the middle. What's going on? What's going on is like this. The Mishnah that we studied in lesson 2 taught that a poor person is obligated to drink 4 cups of wine or grape juice on Passover, even if they are receiving food from the community food bank, right? One of the laws we learned from that is that the community food bank has an obligation to give wine for the 4 cups of wine to poor people. The Gemara asks a simple question. We touched on it last week. Isn't this obvious? Isn't that what a food bank is for? Isn't the food bank supposed to be giving people their needs? So why would the Mishnah need to re-emphasize it, right? The Gemara's answer is that Rabbi Akiva advised his children and all those that he came in touch with not to rely on the public food bank to fund the holiday celebrations, right? And it turns out our Mishnah is teaching us that Passover is the exception to that rule. You can accept money for the 4 cups of wine. Now it turns out that statement that Rabbi Akiva made, which is to his children and to all of his followers, that they should not rely on food from the public food bank for holidays, it was one of 7 pieces of advice that Rabbi Akiva gave his children. Elise, do you want to read them for us, please? It's text 10, page 140. He gave 7 pieces of advice to his children before he passed away.
Okay, my son, do not sit in the busy part of a town and study. Do not dwell in a city whose leaders are Torah scholars. Do not enter your own home unannounced, and certainly not your fellow's home. Do not deprive your feet of shoes. Eat early in the day during summer because of the heat, and during winter because of the cold. If need be, reduce your Shabbos meal to the basics, like a weekday meal, rather than accepting charity by which to enhance the Shabbat meals. Do business with a person who is currently experiencing good fortune.
Thank you, Elise. So it might seem off topic, but there was a loose connection there. You know, one of these 7 pieces of advice helped us answer a question. And then Rav Ashi says, okay, now I'm going to bring you all 7 pieces of advice. The fact that they're not specifically halacha, that's fine. It's still attributable to an Amara, and therefore he puts it in the Talmud. And we'll soon see why he finds that to be very, very important. Now that's not all Agadita. Not all Agadita is life advice. By the way, after these 7 pieces of life advice that Rabbi Akiva gave to his son, we get 5 pieces of life advice that Rabbi Akiva gave to his student, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Beautiful. And it continues in this way until it gets back on topic, and then the meandering river continues and continues, meandering its way through different laws and different Agadita and different pieces of advice. Beautiful. On page 142, we have 5 different types of like categories, if you will, of Agadita, and an example for each one. The first example comes to us from Tractate Megillah. In Tractate Megillah, they start off obviously by discussing how you have to hear the Megillah read on Purim, the whole story of Esther, etc. Beautiful, right? The Gemara eventually meanders its way into a midrashic elaboration on the story of Esther, right? More details about the whole story, and we get 10, 15, maybe even 20 pages worth of that. This is classic Agadita. This is one of 5 classic genres of Agadita. What are they? Teachings regarding the episodes and events described in Tanakh. More details about what's going on. Another category is ethical teachings and life advice offered by individual Tanaim and Amoraim. Can anybody give me an example of that? The one we just gave from Tractate Pesachim, right? Where Rabbi Akiva gives 7 pieces of advice to his son and 5 pieces of advice to his student. Beautiful. Another classic type of Agadita is information and sagas regarding Jewish history. A classic example of this comes to us in the Tractate of Gittin. Gittin is where the laws of divorce are discussed. If there should come a situation where a man and wife need to get divorced, and there's a long discussion about why a man and wife get divorced, and what are good grounds for divorce, and how divorce works from a Jewish perspective. Okay, beautiful. In the middle of that conversation, the Gemara meanders its way into details of the Roman siege of Jerusalem that led to the temple's destruction. In other words, historical details of different things that happened to the Jewish people at that time. And that's a form of Agadita that there isn't there. Another category is stories about individual Tanaim and Amoraim. An example is, in Tractate Brachot, there's an episode, we learned about this in lesson 1, I think it was. There's an episode in which Rabbi Akiva breaches the Roman ban on public teaching Torah and justifies it with the fox and fish parable. Everybody remember that from lesson 1? Yeah? That happens in Tractate Brachot, which is a tractate that talks about blessings and prayers and things like that, things of that nature. And in the middle, the Gemara meanders its way into this story with Rabbi Akiva. The last thing that happened, the last major category of Agadita that you will see in the Talmud is theological or philosophical discussions. An example is something also that we quoted very, very by the by in lesson 1. It's from Tractate Sanhedrin, which is a tradition that every Jew has a portion of the world to come. Oh, only Jews, not non-Jews. What does the world to come mean? Does that mean the souls after a whole discussion about it, right? Does that mean the souls after they pass out from this world, or does that mean the time of Mashiach? A whole discussion about it. What about if somebody sins? Can they still have a portion of the world to come? What type of sin? Do certain sins exclude you from a portion of the world to come? That's a philosophical and theological discussion. It has nothing to do with any practical law. But the Gemara meanders its way into it. Excuse me. And then includes it. The question I'd like to talk about now is why? Why include it? I get it. There must have been thousands of conversations that happened between Gemara sages, Amoraic sages, while they were discussing halachic issues. Why do you have to include all of them in the Talmud? The answer is twofold. The first thing is that the Agadata brings the sages of the Gemara to life. What do I mean? When you learn a statement from Rabbi Akiva, it's one thing to just learn things from Rabbi Akiva. But when you learn about things that Rabbi Akiva taught his son, and things that and stories that happened to Rabbi Akiva, and theological conversations he can have, he now begins to take on life. He begins to take on color, right? Think about when you see something written about in a book, and they're quoting some sort of scholar, you never heard about this scholar before, and that is what it is. Versus when you see something written in a book and they're quoting Albert Einstein. And most likely you have some form of knowledge about Albert Einstein. If you're on this Zoom, you probably know that Albert Einstein, for example, lived in Pasadena for a long period. It gives you much more, it brings him to life. You understand who he is. And if you can read a biography about Albert Einstein, whoa! Now next time you read something about Albert Einstein, there's oh wow, I wonder where he was. Was he at Princeton or was he at Caltech? Where was he when he was saying this, etc.? It brings the whole story to life, and that way makes it much more enjoyable, and it makes us be able to relate to these sages in a much more powerful way. The second reason is because while law might be the body of Torah, Dave is saying this sounds like active versus passive. Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Active versus passive learning. You're not just learning something, you're actually actively hearing it from someone who has come to life, who you feel like is teaching you. Beautiful. And this might be why the laws of the Torah, the laws of the Talmud, are often called the body. But that body needs a soul, right? The Agadata is the soul. There's deeper, it gives us deeper meaning into mitzvot and the purpose of God's creation of the universe. It's true. Technically, to live like a good Jew, you don't need to know this statement, this philosophical statement about the world to come. But if you do, then it gives you much more life in your doing of the mitzvot. Why? Because you understand that there's also a philosophical thing that you're buying into here. Now, do you need that? No, it's not the laws. You don't need it in order to know how to operate. But it's what I would call the soul of the Talmud. And this is why we get text 11, which really talks about how beautiful these pieces of Agadata are. Phil, you want to read for us, please? This is Nachmanides talking about the importance of Agadata.
They are deep cisterns of wisdom that do not lose a drop. All their words possess an inner heart without any concealing husk.
And if you can keep reading for us text 12, where we find a rabbinic teaching that states,
if you wish to recognize the one who spoke the world into being, study the Agada, for through this you will recognize the one who spoke the world into being, and you will cleave to his ways.
In the Agada, or the Agadot in plural, the sages convey to us they received knowledge about God, about his creation of the universe and his ways. And that's it's the soul of Judaism. There's the body of Judaism, which is how to serve God, the things to do to serve God. But then there's why to serve God. That's a much deeper, and it's a very important part of the Torah. That's why Ravina and Rav Ashi included all of these golden nuggets that came up while we were discussing the law during these 500 years. That was the Gemara. During that period, all these other golden nuggets came up, and Ravina and Rav Ashi put them into the Gemara. Even though they didn't put them in an organized fashion, it kind of meanders its way through here and there. And we do get Pirkei Avot, which is kind of a selection of those teachings. Okay, but that's the importance, if you will, of Agadata. Okay, so now you're curious, right? Everybody wants to do a good piece of Agadata and understand it, right? One of these deep cisterns of wisdom. Let's do one, and with this we're going to conclude our lesson with learning one Agadic teaching and understanding it on a little bit of a mystical level. Okay, and this is classic Agadata. In the beginning, when you read it, it's going to seem like such a strange statement, and then with time, we'll be able to unpack some of its deep mystical secrets. We'll start with Ron. If you can read for us, please, the actual Agadata. This one comes to us from Tractate Shabbat on page 77b. Strange order.
Rabbi Zera encountered Rabbi Yehuda, who was standing at the entryway to his father-in-law's house. He observed that Rabbi Yehuda was in an exceptionally positive frame of mind and realized that he could pose any question at all about the world and would receive an answer. Rabbi Zera asked, "Why is it that goats walk ahead of ewes walk behind them?" Rabbi Yehuda responded, "That corresponds to the pattern of the world's creation. First darkness, then light."
This is a strange conversation if I ever saw one. Ron, stay with us for 1 second. Goats tend to be dark colored, right? And sheep are white. Rabbi Yehuda asked Rabbi Zera, sorry, was it the opposite? Yes. Rabbi Zera asked Rabbi Yehuda, why is it that the goats always walk in front of the sheep? Raise your hand if you ever wondered about this. You have? Phil? You're joking. Of course you're joking. No! Who wonders about such a thing? And even if you do, you push it on, you're like, move on, right? Okay. But he has an answer for him. He says it's because dark always goes before light. So the goats are dark and the sheep are light, so the goats go before the dark. And he says that's the way, the dark goes before the light. So he says that's the way it's even baked into creation. Where is that from? Okay, we all know. Ron, text 14 from Genesis. How was the world created?
In the beginning, when God created heaven and earth, the earth was unformed and void. The darkness was over the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light.
So in the creation of the world, first came dark, then came light. Now, if you just read superficially the conversation that we just saw in text 13, it reads a little like a children's book. No? Why do the goats walk in front of the sheep? Because the dark always comes before the light, right? You don't see the deep cisterns containing an inner heart of wisdom that we discussed in previous texts, right? But it turns out that as you begin to unpack it, there's a lot more going on here. So there's a lot of ways of appreciating text 13 and 14 to appreciate what this Haggadah is teaching us. I'll do one of them with you. The Kabbalists teach us, and I know that some of you attended the course called The World of Kabbalah with me. You'll remember this. The Kabbalists teach us that when God wanted to create the world, the biggest impediment that he had was himself. What do I mean? He was trying to create a world that was other. The problem was God was everything, right? God was everywhere, he was everything. There was no other existence other than God, right? So the first thing he had to do was create a space where he was not. What in English, at least figuratively, you would call the dark. A space where the light of God didn't shine, right? And only in Kabbalistic terms, this is called the tzimtzum, when God contracted himself and created a space where he is not, and then he was able to shine in a containable light which would create the world. Right? In other words, he needed to first create dark in order to create light. This is the reason why the Torah describes creation as being dark, and then God creates light, and he sees that it was good because that light, right? In other words, God first had to create a void that appears to be empty of his light, and then follow that by creating a light that creates the world. Rabbi Yehuda was teaching Rabbi Zera that this phenomenon is something that happens throughout a person's life. What do I mean? We all experience moments of darkness, but we need to go through that darkness in order to get to the light. And that's the way life works. He's teaching him a deep truth about the world, and he's teaching him that it's not just by coincidence that it is that way. We all know that you have to go through the dark in order to get to the light, right? I want you all to do this following exercise right now. In your brain, close your eyes for a second, and think about the most challenging experience you've ever had in your life, right? Now think about all the growth that you had as a result of that. Most people, and alcoholics lead the way in this charge, would tell you that was the most challenging and most dark moment in my life, but yet I grew the most from that. In other words, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy, this experience that I experienced, but I also wouldn't trade that for anything in the world. Why? Because through that darkness, I grew into light. Now, when most of us think about this, we just think, yeah, it's just an observable phenomenon in the world. What Rav Yehuda was teaching Rav Zera is that this is not a random fact. The fact that goats walk in front of sheep, the fact that dark comes before light, that's not a random fact. That is something that is baked into the very fabric of creation. God created the world that way. There was a tzimtzum, there was darkness before light. That's why in the physical creation of the world, the dark was created first and then the light, as we are told in Genesis. This is also why every single human being starts off dark and then hopefully becomes light. Think about it. Even according to Tanya, according to the Jewish mystical text from the 1700s, which I know many of you are familiar with. What does it say? A person is born with a nefesh bahamit, with an animal soul. You're born selfish. The animal soul is raging. And then as you enter maturity, your godly soul comes and helps to balance it. And the light is supposed to be the destination. But you have to go through the darkness in order to arrive at the light. Think about any time you understood anything deep in your life. What comes first? Confusion. Darkness, and then with enough toil, you work through the darkness into the light. You work through the confusion into clarity. The same is true in every single one of our lives. Those challenging moments, hopefully each of you has one now that you've thought of, those challenging experiences that you had in life, it is that way because God baked that into the very fabric of creation. That challenge is a moment, so to speak, where God is hiding, And if you work your way through that, you can come to the light, you can come to a space in which God is revealed, and there's blessings, and there's growth, and there's wonderful, wonderful blessings in your life that you only were able to achieve through that darkness. I know that a number of you on this Zoom are members of the Rap Club, and you know this. Each week at the Rap Club is a club where we put on tefillin every single week at 11:15 a.m. on Sunday mornings. And I usually have somebody present on what they do for a living. And I ask them multiple questions. And one of the questions I ask always is, I want to know about the biggest failure in your business. Why? Because we want to know how you grew from that. There's a lot to be learned from that. In other words, don't throw out the dark moments in your life, because through them you can actually reach the ultimate light. And this concludes one example of Agadata. In other words, these additional teachings that are thrown in throughout the meandering river of laws that Ravina and Rav Ashi summarized in the Gemara, all these conversations throughout centuries and throughout countries. And they threw in all of these Agadata in order to bring the Gemara to life, to bring the personalities of the sages to life, to bring these ideas to life, to give you the soul of Torah, if you will, the soul of the Talmud, which is related to it in a deep mystical way. And that is why the Agadata is so important, and Ravina and Rav Ashi needed to include it in the Gemara. With this, we'll conclude today's lesson, which was all about how we created the Talmud. And I'd like to call your attention to the video screens for a summary of today's lesson.
Lesson 4. To create the Talmud. 1. During the century and a half following the Mishnah's composition, the sages of the land of Israel thoroughly examined its teachings. Their own resultant teachings are compiled in the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. 2. The Jewish community in Babylonia became a crucial hub of scholarship, especially during periods of persecution in Israel. The sages of this community produced the Gemara that is most studied today, the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. 3. Rav and Shmuel turned the Babylonian diaspora into the leading center of Torah learning. The debates of Abaya and Rava were a rigorous analysis of halachic teachings that drew on a comprehensive set of sources. 4. Hundreds of sages participated in Talmudic discussions over the centuries. Rav Ashi and his colleagues organized centuries of teachings into a coherent text that was formalized as the Gemara in its current form. 5. The Gemara's compilers strung together conversations that occurred across centuries. They meticulously tracked names and attributions to ensure the integrity of the teachings. 6. The Gemara's comprehensive approach often leads discussions to meander through various topics. The results are a rich tapestry of halakhic content that travels far beyond the immediate Mishnaic text. 7. Agatata, the Talmud's non-legal content, provides profound insights into the spiritual dimensions of Judaism, offering a deeper understanding of God, the soul, and the values underlying Jewish practice.
Thank you all for joining us for Lesson 4. This has been To Create the Talmud. We look forward to meeting you next week for Lesson 5, when we will unpack how the Talmud thinks. A very important lesson where we will do our second sugya, our second actual piece of Gemara. So you'll have to put your Talmudic thinking caps on, and we will properly appreciate different elements of the way that the Talmud analyzes and what exactly Gemara is trying to do, and we will learn to think like a Talmudist. Looking forward to seeing you all there. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.